On March 24, 1971, something strange happened at Winterland in San Francisco. And I don't mean strange in the normal Grateful Dead way. I mean robed men chanting around a roaring bonfire inside a wooden building, 8 feet of flames shooting into the air. Michael Parrish was 17 years old, and his parents had just given him permission to drive to San Francisco on a school night to see the dead. He walked into Winterland around 8 p.m. and immediately thought he'd made a mistake. Winterland is a big wooden building, and this bonfire was going like 8 feet in the air. It was just terrifying, actually. Where's the fire marshal? And how are they able to do this? This wasn't a typical Dead show. It was a benefit concert for something called the Sufi Choir of San Francisco. And before the Dead would play a single note, the audience would sit through hours of spiritual ceremonies, fire walking rituals, kundalini yoga chanting, whirling dervishes clearing the floor for ecstatic dancing, and then, finally, the Sufi Choir themselves. 25 voices performing sacred songs with no instruments, just harmonies, counterpoint, and prayers set to music. The crowd started getting restless. Then they started chanting, "We want the dead! We want the dead!" What happened next depends on who you ask. The choir's musical director thought it was a humiliating disaster. The San Francisco Examiner's music critic called it a glorious, wonderful combination. And the woman recording it all on tape, Betty Cantor, the Dead's legendary sound engineer, captured something that wouldn't be heard publicly for 53 years. This is the story of the night the Grateful Dead tried to play with a Sufi choir, and why the recording sat unreleased in the vault for over half a century. To understand how this strange night happened, you need to know about a man named William Allaudin Mathieu. In 1960, Bill Mathieu was living the dream. He was 23 years old, and Stan Kenton, one of the biggest names in jazz, had just hired him to write arrangements for his orchestra. Mathieu had grown up in Cincinnati, got obsessed with jazz as a kid, and somehow convinced Stan Kenton to let him join the band in Las Vegas. Not bad for a kid from Ohio, but Mathieu wasn't satisfied writing for big bands. He wanted to write for Duke Ellington, so he asked Stan Kenton to write him a letter of recommendation. And somehow, impossibly, Duke Ellington said yes. Mathieu ended up writing 2 arrangements for Ellington's 1960 album Piano in the Background. One was "Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing." The other was "I'm Beginning to See the Light." These weren't just competent arrangements. Duke Ellington himself played solos on them, and they're still out there today, part of the jazz canon. But by 1967, Bill Mathieu was done with jazz. He moved to San Francisco, got hired as the musical director for an improv comedy troupe called The Committee, and started teaching at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And then he went to see the Grateful Dead. "That band woke me up," he said later. "I went to a late-night Dead concert and I was stoned on marijuana, but I think everybody else in the house was stoned on psychedelics." The band played a jam for what might have been 45 minutes. It was one of the peak experiences of my life. This wasn't about the music itself. It was about what the music created. An integrative experience where everyone in the room, the band, the audience, all their combined life experiences, merged into one thing. It wasn't that we were listening to the music, Mathieu said. We were listening to basically the universe as it was presented to us at that time.
Boys and things will come by the dozen. Ain't nothing but drugstore love. Pretty little thing, let me like to count, 'cause mama, I'm so hard to handle now, yes I am.
Around that same time, Mathieu met a spiritual teacher named Samuel Lewis. Everyone called him Sufi Sam. Sam Lewis was 70 years old, a genuine eccentric who'd been seeking spiritual truth since the 1920s. He'd studied with Sufi teachers in India, written books about socialist reform movements, and somehow ended up as the lovable, grand old man of the San Francisco hippie scene. One of Sam's innovations was something called the Dances of Universal Peace. Simple line dances set to sacred songs from different traditions. They looked a little corny, but people who experienced them said they could be genuinely transcendent. In early 1970, Sam Lewis asked Bill Mathieu to form a choir. Mathieu agreed, changed his name to Allaudin, and started composing. "I wrote in a kind of a big band, folky gospel style that was very Europeanized. It was full of counterpoint. It was kind of a hybrid of everything I'd known. The Sufi Choir was born. Sacred phrases, Shri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram, Om Namah Shivaya, set to music that sounded like nothing else. Big band jazz meets folk gospel meets Sanskrit mantras. And they were good, really good. Here's where the connections start to matter. One of the Sufi choir's lead singers was a man named Philip Davenport. His Sufi name was Vashist. He'd worked for an underground newspaper called the San Francisco Oracle. And more importantly, he was a supplier for Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. Philip Vashist was one of the suppliers for Jerry and the Dead, Allaudin said. And that's how I met Jerry Garcia. And that's how I met Janis Joplin. And that's how I met other guys in the band. The Dead and the Sufi Choir existed in the same world. Not the rock and roll world exactly, but the broader San Francisco scene. The Oracle had published a strange, mystical piece by Robert Hunter about the Grateful Dead as a starship. Spiritual seekers went to Dead shows. Deadheads went to Holy Man jams. It was eclectic. Everything was coming together. And Mickey Hart, the Dead's drummer, really liked the Sufi Choir. He offered to let them rehearse and record in his barn.
Gave them the keys to his equipment, told them to use it anytime. He was so sweet to give us that first experience in a real studio, Allaudin remembered. So when someone suggested the Sufi Choir should open for the Dead at a benefit concert, it made sense. The Dead were the big attraction. The Sufi Choir would perform their sacred music. And maybe, at the end, they'd play something together. Fascists set it all up. There was just one problem. By the time the benefit actually happened, Mickey Hart was gone. In mid-February 1971, the Dead had traveled to the Capitol Theater in Port Chester, New York to record a live album. They brought a batch of new songs. The shows went well, but on the second night, Mickey Hart didn't appear on stage. Internal drama involving his father embezzling money from the Dead. Mickey wouldn't return until October 1974. The Dead suddenly had one drummer instead of two, and the Sufi Choir had just lost their biggest supporter within the band. But the show was already booked. Winterland, March 24th, a Wednesday night, a benefit for the Sufi Choir of San Francisco. They were committed. The plan was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. The benefit wouldn't just be the Sufi Choir and the Dead. There would be other spiritual groups performing. Kailash Shigendo, a Buddhist sect, would do firewalking ceremonies on stage. Yogi Bhajan, the Kundalini yoga teacher who founded Golden Temple and later Yogi Tea, would give a talk. His disciples would chant and sway, and then the Sufi Choir would perform. And then, hopefully, the Dead would join them for a few songs at the end. Philip Elwood, the San Francisco Examiner's music critic, showed up that night and described the scene. About 4,000 miscellaneous characters filled Winterland. Dead fans, freaks, mystics, religionists, spiritualists, and a few semi-straights. There were some mighty strange doings at Winterland last night, Elwood wrote. Michael Parrish arrived and saw the bonfire. Then he watched as Buddhist practitioners in Oriental hiking attire performed their firewalk. Then Yogi Bhajan spoke. His disciples chanted. The floor cleared for whirling dervishes. It was fascinating. It was also very long. They'd planned too many speeches, Allaudin said later. These holy dudes just didn't know when to stop. Spiritual teaching is not known for its brevity. The rock-oriented portion of the audience started getting restless. They'd come to see the Grateful Dead. They'd been sitting through hours of ceremonies, and the Dead still hadn't appeared. People started clapping in unison, then chanting, "We want the Dead! We want the Dead!" By the time the Sufi Choir finally took the stage, the room was noisy. People were talking, moving around. The energy was scattered. Allaudin tried to adapt. He cut the slower songs from the set list, went straight to the up-tempo material, and then, after the first song, he discovered something terrible. One of the microphones was dead. The alto section couldn't be heard. That's pretty serious for a soprano, alto, tenor, bass choir, Allaudin said. He tried to get help, rushed to the soundboard upstairs, tried to find the right fader, thought he'd fixed it, rushed back to the stage. The mic was still dead. I felt pretty abandoned by the whole thing, he said. The choir reconfigured, kept performing, and the chanting from the crowd grew louder. We want the Dead. We want the Dead. It was becoming deafening. Allaudin made a decision. He motioned to the Dead. Come on, help us. Jerry Garcia, Phil Lesh, Bob Weir, and Bill Kreutzmann walked on stage. This was unusual. The Dead rarely appeared alongside other musicians. They'd backed a few people here and there. David Crosby, John Hendricks on a single called Fire in the City, but a full collaboration with a 25-voice choir? That was new territory. The Dead started with Shri Ram, a call-and-response chant. The choir sang. The audience was supposed to respond. They sort of didn't. We want the Dead, some people kept chanting, but the Dead stayed. They provided droning chords underneath the choir's harmonies. Garcia's guitar wove around the melodies. Phil Lesh laid down a harmonic foundation. It was tentative,
You can hear it on the tape. The dead are feeling out the space, trying to find where they fit. They're not cutting loose. They're being respectful, almost too respectful. Michael Parrish, watching from the audience, thought it was beautiful. Very much sort of like what happened at the Egypt shows when they were accompanying Hamza El-Din and his troupe of musicians. And it was beautiful. It was really just transcendent music. But Allaudin on stage was frustrated. He'd wanted the dead to solo, to really play. They wouldn't do it. They were just sort of standing there making rhythmic motions. They wouldn't solo. And that disappointed me. The dead stayed for 3 songs total. Shri Ram, then the 23rd Psalm, and then finally, Hallelujah. And here's where something shifted. On Hallelujah, the dead started to feel it. You can hear it on the tape. They find a pocket that sounds like the brighter corners of their Dark Star jams. The choir builds into a double-time vocal layer. The dead respond with a groove that actually works. For that minute there, the Sufi Choir is playing with the dead, Allaudin said. We're all playing together, and it's kind of fun. The crowd didn't know what to do. The sound became deafening, not from chanting anymore, from genuine energy. For 1 minute, maybe 2, it actually worked, and then it was over. The choir left the stage. The dead stayed and launched into their own set. Allaudin went home that night feeling defeated. I was kind of humiliated and defeated by the whole thing, he said. I thought it was a shock.
I got sort of roped into this. He'd been on stage with the Grateful Dead, sure, but the technical problems, the restless crowd, the feeling that nobody was listening, it all added up to what felt like a disaster. And then, the next day, he read Philip Elwood's review in the San Francisco Examiner. Elwood loved it, so out came the Grateful Dead, immediately plunging into electric accompaniment for the Sufi Choir. It was a glorious, wonderful combination. The review praised the collaboration, called the crowd enthusiastic, said the music was beautiful. Allaudin couldn't believe it. There is a glowing rave review about the Sufi Choir and the Grateful Dead, saying they'd never heard such beautiful music in their life. I thought, well, you never know. Backstage that night, Elwood had caught Jerry Garcia for a quote. Garcia thumped Elwood's chest and said something that captured the whole experiment. It's all in the spirit right there. We get it from music, they get it in their own way, but the spirit's the same. We're all one. Meanwhile, Betty Cantor had recorded the entire collaboration. Her tapes went into the dead. Who were there. Allaudin moved on. The Sufi Choir made 3 albums together in the 70s. Their music got more intricate, more polished. They became part of the Bay Area's spiritual landscape. Samuel Lewis's Dances of Universal Peace spread to 71 countries. The choir's 1973 self-titled album is still considered a classic of sacred music. And then, in November 2024, the Good Ol Grateful Deadcast got access to Betty Cantor's recording. They premiered excerpts on their episode called The Dead and the Sufi Choir, 3/71. Fans could finally hear what actually happened. Shri Ram, the 23rd Psalm, Hallelujah. Jesse Jarnow, one of the Deadcast hosts, listened to the full tape and put it perfectly. The tape isn't as bad as Allaudin's slightly traumatized memory suggests, but it's not the intended result either. It was rough. It was chaotic. The crowd was restless. The tech failed. Mickey Hart wasn't there. But on that last song, for just a minute or two, something worked. The dead found a groove with the Sufi Choir. And you can hear what Jerry Garcia meant about the spirit being the same. 7 years later, in 1978, the dead would collaborate with Hamza El-Din at Winterland. That time, they'd rehearse. That time, it would work more smoothly. And music historians would point to it as an important moment in the dead's evolution toward world music fusion. But the Sufi Choir came first, and for 53 years, the recording sat unreleased in the archive, waiting. Now, we can finally hear it. The night everything went wrong, and somehow, for just a moment, went right.